Good. Great. Well, welcome. Hello. Good morning. My name is Kelly Deshawn. I'm the Executive Director for an organization here in Galveston, Texas, called the Galveston Island Park Board of Trustees. I worked for several years in the Caribbean with some of you, and since moving to Texas, I have become quite knowledgeable about an item that you all are dealing with now, which is seaweed management. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are very relevant to how we manage sargassum or seaweed here in Texas, but having worked in the Caribbean for 20 years, I'm hoping that some of the ideas that we'll share with you will be relevant for you as well. Just so that you know who I am, as I said, spent 20 years working in the Caribbean region. I worked for the Caribbean Hotel Association, as a matter of fact, and had the opportunity to work for the Caribbean Alliance of Sustainable Tourism. And for many years, I worked with Grupo Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic in operations directly, including responsibility for the management of the beach and management of several operational departments. And then I worked in the beautiful destination of La Romana Bayaibe, which was a blue flag certified beach and destination, and I'm hoping that some of you are as well. I currently am the Executive Director for the Galveston Island Park Board of Trustees. My mother keeps asking me how, after a career in tourism, I am now in Parks and Recreation, but indeed I'm not. The Park Board is responsible for the Convention and Visitors Bureau here on the island. We manage the 6 million visitors that we get here on an annual basis. And in addition to promoting the Convention and Visitors Bureau, we manage 32 miles of beach. All of that might be very interesting, but my real credential to speak to you all today is from my experience. Whoops. In what I have come to dub the summer of seaweed. What some of you all are experiencing now, Galveston experienced last year, and some of the methodologies and practices that I'm going to share with you today are concepts and programs that we've developed over many years, because being in the Gulf with shallow, warm waters with a lot of nutrients in it, sargassum or seaweed is something that we deal with regularly. However, we had never seen anything like we saw last year, and this is just to put it in perspective for you, some of the landings that we dealt with last year. Today I want to talk to you about 3 items, 3 areas. The first is just understanding the role sargassum plays in the building and nourishment of our beaches and the wider ecosystem. I know it's a nightmare right now to deal with, but it's super important that you do that in an appropriate manner, and that your response is appropriate for the important resource that you're managing, which is your beach. I'm going to speak to you about some of the best practices that we've developed specifically around planning, some of the equipment that you might be able to utilize, timing, when you do the cleaning, and placement, where you actually put the material after you've gathered that. And then I want to end about and giving you some pointers on developing an environmental education campaign, because speaking to your visitors is part of an overall program. So really, what is the problem? Sargassum, or landings on our coast, impedes coastal access. It prohibits people from laying on the beach and enjoying the area. Specifically for you in the Caribbean, it's not what visitors expect. Here we put on all of our marketing programs, these are collateral materials, these big, wide, beautiful white beaches, and when they get down there, they don't expect to see 3 feet of seaweed impeding their access to the coast. It doesn't look very good, and some of you might know that if you leave it in the water or on the ground for too long, it actually gets pretty stinky. It's also difficult to manage, and depending on how you manage the seaweed on your beach, you can have significant impacts on what is your single most important natural resource. And then to complicate matters a little bit more, it is a habitat for endangered wildlife. Last year during the summer of seaweed, we had over 50 turtle landings, endangered green turtles here on the beach, where we'd never had that previously, and so that merited unto itself another approach to how we managed and collected the seaweed. So what is it and why can't you hate it? I know that at this moment in your lives, when you're dealing with the landings and the visitor complaints, that it's just really hard to be appreciative for what seaweed is, but it does play an important part in our larger ecosystem, and I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize that role that sargassum has. It is, of course, a floating ecosystem, and when it's out in the ocean, it's a habitat for a large variety of marine life, including mammals such as dolphins. It's a brown algae, and I think you probably already discovered as the water gets warmer and there's more nutrients in that water, it grows. And I think that that's an important thing for you to know, because like ourselves, you've probably contemplated, can I net off my beach and keep it out in the water? Yes, you could do that, but it will continue to grow, and at some point, through experience, I can tell you it will grow over your nets and actually begin to invade the area that you've kind of cordoned off. So we've discovered that it's best to get as much of the material up out of the water and onto the beach template so that it can be collected as possible. Once that it does come onto your beach, if you can maintain it onto the beach template, it's an amazing resource, and it does act as, I call it a Velcro. It kind of just grabs the sand material, gives it something to adhere to, it gives it a higher viscosity, which means that the grains can actually hold together, and it helps to protect your beach from erosion. I had the opportunity to work in beaches in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and while some of you might not have a problem with sediment or sand or erosion, a lot of the beaches that I knew were battling erosion, and you wouldn't want to do anything that would compromise your beach, and removing the sargassum, I'm sorry to say, could indeed compromise your beach. So remember at all times that when you're dealing with sargassum and seaweed, that it is of the utmost importance that you protect what is your underlying asset, which is your beach. So I want to talk just a minute about, gathering resources and working on a regional level as opposed to just an isolated level. Here in Galveston, we have what's called a BMAC, or a Beach Maintenance Advisory Committee, and this committee has been so essential to us in garnering the resources that we need to be able to better understand and manage sargassum and seaweed in our destination. On that BMAC, we've got university researchers, scientists, business owners, hotel association executive representatives, non-for-profit members, and DMO, or destination management organization staff, which is people like myself. This committee meets monthly. In the height of the seaweed, we were meeting more regularly. They set our policy for the activities that we're going to do. They help to communicate that policy to the wider community. They bring resources to the table that we would never have. The researchers, for example, and I'm going to share with you here in just a minute, one of the websites that we use regularly that was developed by a university here on the island. They give us monitoring and forecasting. Some of the NGOs in town, the Turtle Restoration Network was essential to us when we had to have turtle monitors because of regulatory requirements here in the States. They got out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and walked the beaches for us and looked for endangered species. And I just can't emphasize enough the importance of bringing some of these other institutions or agencies to the table to help you on a destination level identify resources and move forward. Another important thing in the destination is consistent messaging from all of the partners. You're living in a very difficult situation right now if you're dealing with significant seaweed landings, and it's important the way that your staff and others in the destination respond to these visitors' complaints. We identified in our own facilities rainy day programs in the morning when we would do the first assessment and identify the areas that were hardest hit. We would then send out a communication to the concierge and to the front desk operators so they would know, for example, where there had not been landings and where they could direct people to the beach, or they came up with alternate messagings on days that it was just going to be really difficult, and so we encourage people to do activities such as shopping or sightseeing or things that weren't going to have them on the beach. But that was all part of a pre-planning process for us. We also monitor and share information, and I've listed here a website, Seas Forecast. I'm going to share with you in just a minute a couple of the forecast advisories that are actually for your area. If you go on to this web page, you'll see there's an area where you can sign up for advisories and they'll actually send them to you. It's based on satellite imagery from NASA. As they go over once a week, they can actually see the sargassum patches in the ocean, and determining the drifts and the wind, they can make estimates about when and if those landings are going to hit your area. For us, that was really important because we knew that if we had large landings, we needed to staff up. We brought in extra personnel. We rented additional equipment and could really just blow up our effort in order to respond to what we saw. And on the backside of that, if it looked like we were going to have a week clean or a couple of days clean, then we knew that we could let go of some of that temporary staff, release some of that equipment, and not be incurring those costs, which were very high. Then the other thing we did is we developed what I call poke in the eye products. At some point, we just couldn't fight it anymore, and we had to embrace it and talk about it as just part of the reality of Gulf Coast tourism, at least for us in the Gulf Coast here. Some of the things we did was a Seaweed art contest. We had 50 applicants that came in and they built, and I put a little picture of something there, art on the beach, and we gave an award. The other, just to show you, is a postcard that picture there from the 1950s, so you can see we've been dealing with it for a long time. Some of the other things that came up that were very innovative last year is that some of the spas and the hotels started offering seaweed spa treatments. Again, just to kind of poke fun at ourselves. There was a local entity that created a seaweed soap. We have a local brewery on island that, believe it or not, created a seaweed beer. Fortunately, you couldn't taste it, but it was a product that we put out there. We actually worked with Texas A&M as well, and they built us a baler. We are in Texas, and so we do have a lot of hay and a lot of cows, and we were able to adapt a piece of machinery that we could bale and compress the seaweed, which made hail bays or seaweed bales, and then we used those as blocks and made dunes for the coastline. Dunes here in Texas are very important as a form of coastal protection for the infrastructure behind the beachfront. And then there was actually a local artist that came up with a song, What to Do with So Much Seaweed, and it was a sing-along, and in the hotels they would sing some of that, and when we would go out in the wider community, we would share that sing-along as well. And again, it's just to kind of make fun or laugh at yourself, because it is undoubtedly a difficult and almost impossible task to deal with in some cases when it lands. This is a shot, and you can see by the web address up there in the corner, from the Seas Forecast. This particular one was from Puerto Rico. They do have Barbados, Bermuda. They are doing the Yucatan Peninsula as well. And if you send Captain Webster, who is responsible for the Seas program, Seas is Sargassum Early Advisory System, he will begin to send you advisories. What this shows is that they can outline the mats, and those are the yellow portions that you see floating out there. And I think what I would comment to you on this one is you can see that yellow drift to the south of San Juan, and boy, if you compare that to the size of the island, it's pretty big. They'll then tell you how many miles off, if it looks like it's going to come, and in this case it's not going to hit Puerto Rico. It looked like it was going to hit the Dominican Republic. Here's another one for Barbados. Good news on the 16th for Barbados. No landings in that area and no visual. I would really encourage you, if you haven't already identified a way to monitor and know what you're dealing with ahead of time, to look at signing up for the SEAS forecast. There's a couple of items that when you're preparing to manage seaweed on the beach that I would really like to encourage you to think about. The first is to determine a threshold for action. You know, your personnel gets out there and they're going to clean every day. If you've told them to clean, they're going to clean every day. But we would really like to encourage you to think about what is the threshold. In Galveston, where we receive a lot of seaweed, this picture is not a condition in which we would get out and clean. We recognize the benefits of the sargassum. It's not worth it. Our beaches are eroding, and the mechanized and even manual collection of seaweed can undermine the viability of the beach. And so in cases like this is our threshold, and we don't collect. Discourage just grooming of the beach for regular maintenance. If you're out there every day and you're hitting that beach every day with mechanized, especially equipment, then you're making your beach vulnerable. And so unless you've got some secret sand source sitting off the shore, I would really encourage you to be very careful about how you interact with the beach. Allow grooming of the dry beach. And this is the case that some of you might have mechanized beach rakes, and I'm going to show some of those. And prohibit the use of heavy construction equipment for grooming purposes. I know in the Caribbean, where manual labor is more reasonable than it is here in the United States, that you might not be using heavy equipment, but for those of you who are, really consider the type of equipment that you're using, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. The other thing that's important beforehand is that you establish protocols for wildlife sightings. You do have endangered flora or fauna that uses your beaches and your habitats, and when you're dealing with so much seaweed, it is important that you have a plan in place so that the workers know that if they see a nesting Kemp Ridley's, what they should do and how they proceed. And that's going to be really important, especially because a lot of you all will be hosting visitors from Europe or from the Americas, and as a lot of you know, the sense of environmental stewardship is very strong in some of these developed countries, and how you manage seaweed on the beach and how you provide for potential wildlife is going to be an opportunity for you, or it's going to be a point of criticism for you. So it's important that you think about it ahead of time. The other thing I really want to encourage you to do ahead of time is to determine where your deposit sites are. And let me back up for just a minute and say, if you can avoid taking the material off the beach, avoid taking the material off the beach, because no matter how you collect it, sort it, sift it, manage it, you're going to have sand inside of that material. And if you're collecting that material on a regular basis, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, then you are impacting your beach, and it is important that you maintain the viability of your beach by maintaining that material as much as possible in the vicinity. So what that means, and this is a picture of the Galveston seawall. As I mentioned, we manage 32 miles of beach, and so we have to be very sophisticated and very organized in the manner that we do this. This is our seawall beaches where we've got a series of groins. This probably represents a 2-mile stretch. When we go in, we identify where we're going to place the material, and it's mounds. I have no illusion about how much material this is. I manage these issues on a regular basis, and so I know the volumes that can arrive to the coastline. When we consider where we're going to make deposit sites, we look at where is the vehicular and pedestrian access, where do we as operation people need to be able to get into the beach and move around, and where are visitors accessing the beach. And are there areas outside of that access or those paths that people use that we can use as storage areas? If you have a dune system, it's best not to put the material on top of the dune and the dune vegetation, but to put it at what they call the south toe, or the the bottom of the dune facing the ocean. If you can avoid it, do not let equipment or people with wheelbarrows move over your beach vegetation. Again, that beach vegetation and that root system is important in maintaining the integrity of your beach, and you wouldn't want to do anything to damage that. It's important to keep deposit sites close to each other. I put 500 feet, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about why I put 500 feet. It's related to the equipment in the case that you're using equipment. But basically you want to keep them close to each other so that as you collect the material, you don't have to run far to place it. You want to be close to your deposit site so you don't lose time and resources in transporting the material far, but keeping it as close as possible, both for when you collect it and store it, and then for afterwards as you need to push that back out, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're going to have to establish some height. We call them cat piles on the beach. When we collect the seaweed, we make these big kind of scratch piles. I'm a tall person. I'm almost 6 foot tall, and these piles are probably overshadow me by 3 or 4 feet. In addition to that, you want to try to look for sunny places. Don't put it under a bunch of coconut trees. It's going to get stinky, smelly. It's like a compost pile. It's organic material, and the more that you can put that in a sunny place and kind of aerate it, the faster it's going to decompose. We did have an important aha moment last year. We had requests to fumigate the piles because of the gnats that were generated out of those piles, but we actually learned from some of the scientists that we're working with that those gnats are essential in decomposing the seaweed, and without the gnats, the seaweed will not decompose as quickly. So even if you have a little problem with bugs, just think about it more from a position of where do I locate the seaweed, as opposed to fumigating the seaweed, because you'll only exacerbate the problem by fumigating those piles by extending the time that they need to decompose. So that's kind of some of the things that you should do ahead of time. You need to, have a policy in place to let people know you're not going to be moving wheelbarrows of sand off the beach. Identify the deposit sites, make sure that those deposit sites work for how people are using the beach, and make sure that you have a wildlife protocol in the case that your teams encounter any endangered species on the beach. So once you're ready to start operating, we use mechanized equipment here. I sincerely do not know how we could move the volume of material that we move with manual labor. Again, I've managed teams for a long time down in the Dominican Republic and in Puerto Rico. I know that manual labor is the predominant way that we maintain our beaches down there, but in these extraordinary circumstances, it might be recommendable that you consider using mechanized equipment, and you probably have some of this equipment available in the destination already. When making a selection about the equipment, I'd like to share with you some of the things that we've learned. First off is no track, belted, or skid equipment. That, in other words, only used wheeled equipment. Anything like this bobcat over here that's got the belt or the tracks on it, that's really going to tear up your beach. And while you might remove all of the seaweed, what you're going to be left with is these tire ruts or track wrecks on your beach that do not look good, but not only that, they compromise the integrity and the stability of the beach by clamping into the beach and using the beach as a manner to propel itself. So really avoid any of that kind of equipment. Also avoid scraping, dragging, or pushing material. Really what you want to be able to do is have a piece of equipment that goes in there and lifts and carries as opposed to pushing forward the material. So that means no road graders, and this picture that I have here on the left it's a road grader. It's got a blade that's going through it, and I know that might look attractive right there, but the damage that was done to this beach, they dropped the elevation by at least a foot after having done that all summer, and they really just did a disservice to themselves by the damage that they did. And ultimately, you want to try to move, scrape, and transport as little sand as you can. And I'll use this picture over here to illustrate. You'll see right here the bobcat, he's pushing sand. Can you see the amount of sand that he's pushing? And these are little piles, and these piles I bet were not made by that bobcat. I bet this was a rake, and I want to show you what a rake looks like. Oh, not yet. Let me go to this one first. So again, use wheeled equipment only, and if you're going to be operating in the dark, then you want to work with lights, both for safety of your personnel, but for the wildlife as well. And I'm going to talk about timing here in just a minute for you and why you might be working in the dark. Mechanized rakes are best, but they do take longer. Some of you might know, and I know that CAS put out in their resource guide a link to a YouTube video on Barber. We use Barber surf rakes. They're wonderful. They are not Barber in particular, but mechanized surf rakes are by far the most environmentally responsible piece of equipment that you can use for these activities. But because of their limited capacity to collect material, it requires that you run the rake over the same trajectory several times. And so if you're dealing with a large geographic area, that might be challenging for you. And we've worked out what I call the Texas two-step, and I'm going to share that with you in a minute. But the rakes do take a little bit longer. I would like to say a rake, and I'll show it to you here in a minute, probably in the States between the rake and the tractor is a $100,000 investment. So I know not what that investment would cost you in the Caribbean, so it's a significant investment. But it does have uses outside of maintaining seaweed. We use it for litter control in green spaces and parking lots, and on the beach just to collect trash. And it collects little or no sand. The other piece of equipment, and you see it down here, and maybe some of these pictures look like something that you're dealing with now, is front-end loaders, and this is what my team prefers. I prefer the safe rake. They prefer the front-end loader, and you can see why here. It allows them to move just an amazing amount of volume of material at the same time. And the front-end loader, as opposed to the bulldozer, has a bucket. And so we use a floating mechanism on the bucket. What the floating mechanism does is this is your beach elevation. It allows the bucket to ride 1 inch or 2 inches above the beach. So it's not scraping the material of the beach. It's digging into the seaweed material and then lifting that up. Keep in mind that when you're working like that, that the material is super heavy because it's very wet, and so you can't go a long way. You have to take as much as you can get in the bucket, lift the bucket, and then go to your deposit site and come back. And that's why it's important that those deposit sites are relatively close to the area where you're going to transport. This is the raking equipment. It gets the 2 stars. You can see here it's got a conveyor belt. What happens is this is an agricultural tractor. The one down here on the bottom does not have a front bucket. This one on the top does have a front bucket, and I'll talk about that in just a second. What it does is with your agricultural tractor, you pull this piece of equipment. This is the largest piece of equipment I think that Barber offers, and this rake costs us $50,000. It's got a conveyor belt that runs around. The material comes in, you run over the material, it feeds up here, it bounces along this conveyor belt, the sand bounces out, and then it is collected back here in the bucket, which you can back up and dump. And you see how little sand is collected in these piles, which is significantly different from the piles that we collect with the front-end loaders, which will be, as I said, taller than me. This is another kind of rake. This is up here on the top. This is not a mechanized rake, and we've got a lot of people who are not very fond of these rakes on the island. These are hard-tined rakes. Maybe some of you have them. They will work. You create what windrows or piles, and once the pile gets so big, then the rake can't collect anymore, and then you have to swing around with the bucket and then scoop it up and put it in the bucket and take it to your deposit site. So that kind of rake will work. It's not nearly as effective as the mechanized rake. These are the pieces of equipment that the part board utilizes. Here's your rubber-tired front-end loader. As I mentioned, it has a float mechanism which allows this bucket to ride above the elevation of the beach, ensuring that it doesn't gouge or scrape the beach. And then over here, we have a maintenance crew, and they adapted this one on the right-hand side here. They call it the Beast. And how they adapted the Beast is they put teeth on it to be able to collect or grab the sargassum better, and then they welded on these side pieces to give it a larger reach farther around, and then it's of course got slots in it so that the water can drain out of it so it's not as heavy. The teams here have perfected what I call the Texas two-step. It's a dance, and you have to keep in mind I am in Texas, and in Texas we do have resources, I'm happy to say. After working for many years with limited resources, it's really nice to be in this environment. We spend on Galveston Island $3.5 million a year maintaining the beaches that we have. So we do have some resources, and I do understand that not all of this equipment will be available to you, and that you're working with different scenarios and different limitations. What the teams do here is they take the front end loader, and you can see the amount of seaweed that's able to collect compared to the picture that we saw with the mechanized rake previously. They'll take the first swing at the beach, or the first pass at the beach with the front end loader, and then they come back with the surf rake, which is this one, and do the grooming of it. And you can see here the wall of seaweed that they were working at. Once you start to work, there's a couple things you need to do. First, you need to establish a weekly schedule for the morning low tide. Most of you will probably know that there's 2 high and low tides a day. What you're looking for is the morning low tide. That could happen at 1 o'clock in the morning, it could happen at 6 o'clock in the morning, and in the seaweed season, our teams are scheduled according to the morning low tide as opposed to any kind of fixed schedule that they have. The reason being is because you want to have your team start when the tide starts to go out, because as the tide goes out, it's laying the sargassum down on the beach, and that's the most appropriate time to collect it. It's definitely easier to collect the sargassum when it's out of water. When it's in water, it's really tough, and we actually recommend we don't let our teams work in the water with the sargassum because it just tears up the beach too much. So if you schedule them as the tide comes out, the seaweed lays on the ground, and then you can collect it. That does mean that you should get on your NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, or other Caribbean Institute agencies who have schedules that will show you when that tide cycle is happening and when you can expect the low tide, and schedule around that. In the mornings, we send our supervisor out, sometimes the evening before, to determine what are the areas that have been hit the worst, and we always start with our high-use areas first. So those areas where we know that people congregate, where around the water sports activities, a favorite sun tanning area, we clean those areas first, and then we work out. And that needs to be a part of your communications as well, so the front desk or the concierge or the animation team can say to people, hey, you know, they're going to be cleaning, but go over there and hit it over, go sit over there, or this area is going to be clean, so that people know where to look for. Again, and you're going to hear me say it over and over again, if it's not significant and you don't have to pick it up, then don't. And I'm sure your idea of what merited cleaning last year compared to this year is significantly different, and I would encourage you to embrace that. It's part of our ecosystem, it smells like the ocean, and a little bit of seaweed is not the end of the world. Before the teams start, walk the beach with lights for endangered species. If you're cleaning with heavy equipment, do not work in the swash line. That's that area where the water is coming up and going down, and I'm going to talk to you about that in just a second, because if you're working in that wet area, you're just really going to tear up the beach a lot more. And I want to go back to this picture here, and you can see what happened on this beach right here. It's just looking, of course, terrible. The birds are having a day of it. Is that it got to an area that it started to stack up, and we couldn't get into dry beach, and so we had to work on wet beach. And look at what it does to the beach and how it looks. We discovered after a while we stopped cleaning in certain areas where that happened because it was worse to deal with it than it was not to deal with it. And lo and behold, when the season ended and all the material decomposed, we had amazing beaches under the seaweed. It was really a lesson learned for us. So stay out of the swash line. You're going to do more damage than you're going to do good. Leave a rack line. A rack line is when flotsam and material gathers in that swash zone. That's that line of material that you see when you walk down the beach that kind of separates where the shells are and where they aren't. And I'll show you right here. You see what we learned to do, and you can see the seaweed out in the ocean. Those brown patches out there, that's all seaweed coming in. So what the teams would do, because of course the seaweed doesn't stop coming in after you've cleaned the beach, is that they would build a berm, and they would just kind of let the material pile up there in the swash zone, and that would create a barrier so that as more material came in, it couldn't come up all the way on the beach. It just kind of started making a barrier there. That kept then the upper beach here clean and usable for people, and then we would break little aisles into the barrier so that people could actually get out into the water. And you can see that line all the way along the beach. Yes, it doesn't look ideal, but look at this great area that people then have to be able to recreate. This is a deposit site for us. This is 7 feet tall, and that represented maybe 2 days of cleaning material. I hear you, Adriana, and I'm almost there. These are, again, piles of seaweed. This was during the season last year, and then what we did is as that decomposed, we pulled those piles after the season back down onto the beach, and you can see this is the sand, and you can see the elevation difference that was collected in the seaweed piles. And so if we had removed those piles from the beach, we would have lost that material. And you've got to protect your beach. So part of what we learned last year in the Summer of Seaweed was it was really important to communicate consistently with visitors. On one of the beaches where we just had to give up cleaning altogether because it wasn't viable anymore, this was a 6-foot by 4-foot billboard that we put up. You can see it, the 8th wonder of the world, and boy, it sure felt like it at times. And talked about it, what the importance of seaweed to building our beaches was, and then we had this little scavenger hunt because these are actually animals that you'll shirts or orange shirts with these big buckets, and they would shake out the seaweed in the bucket. This is a sargassum fish. He's kind of a frog-like fish. He's got little fingers instead of fins. And they would work with visitors along the beach and show what was in the seaweed. And by showing people kind of the touchy-feely animal feel-good pieces of the seaweed, we actually were able to convert some of the thinking. And at the same time, they went out with this rack card, that we put up at the desk, we put up in the visitor center, and it talked about Seaweed Scavenger Hunt and what you could find. Any of these materials, I'd be happy to send them over to CAST, and they can distribute them or make them available for you as well. And then we have some Seaweed Saves Galveston Beaches little bracelets, like the Lance Armstrong bracelets, just as little giveaways on the beach. And with that, I would be more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Kelly?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, we have a few questions that have been sent to us via chat. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and send your questions right now. And I wanted to also, we had some audio issues in the beginning, and we didn't hear our introduction, that this video will be available to everyone at the end of the webinar. We're going to make it live on YouTube. So the video will be available, on this wonderful presentation that Kelly has put together will be available for everyone to see. But you lucky folks that are able to speak with Kelly right now on the webinar will actually be able to ask her questions, and she will be able to answer all of your concerns. Likewise, if we run out of time with questions and aren't able to answer all of them, she will be happy to do so. All of her contact information is in the last slide, so feel free to send her an email, and I'm sure Kelly will be kind enough to answer your questions. So let's go with the first question. The first question is from Jean-Marc Flambert, and he has the question, he says, can you collect and create bales and dump back into the sea with a weight? Is that feasible?
You know, at one point we got really desperate, and we talked about collecting the material in a barge, taking it offshore and dumping it again. Our concern with that activity, and I would say maybe weighting it and dumping it in the ocean is going to be the same, is that as it starts to disintegrate, you're going to find it right back up on your beaches because of the currents. My neighbors down south in South Padre Island, they have narrow beaches. What they do is they trench the back beach, so they dig a ditch, they put the seaweed in there, and then they cover it with sand. We have another neighbor down south who doesn't put it on the beach template, you know, this being the back and this being on the front, but they look for areas on the side. You know, I know it's a tremendous amount of material and you're looking for a place to keep it. All I can say to you is I would encourage you to keep it as close to the beach as you can. It will have a lot of sand materials in it. And if you're looking to put it off ocean or offshore, just be aware that the currents might bring it back to you.
Okay, hope that answered your question, Sean. The next person is Kay Pratt. She says, my name is Kay. I live on St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. My question is, do you know if the Virgin Islands has an action plan to manage the impact of sargassum? We had a lot along our shorelines last December. I would like to be part of any plan of action in the Virgin Islands.
You know, I personally don't know what your destinations are doing on a national or on a local basis. I would encourage you, because this is an economic issue for you, to work collaboratively with either the University of the West Indies, your local environmental agencies, your not-for-profits, and other institutions like that to devise a program. You all have a real challenge in the sense that sargassum is something that Galveston deals with regularly. Oddly enough, after last year's Summer of Seaweed, this year we have had not an ounce of seaweed. We've got equipment that's sitting in workshops right now waiting to be utilized that we're not putting into use because we don't have any seaweed. So how you respond this summer is going to really probably be only part of the equation, and in the sense that you'll have to know, or you'll have to discover with time, is this an issue that the Caribbean is now going to face on an ongoing basis, and what does that merit from both the private sector, the civil sector, and the governmental sector? I can tell you that even though we don't have any seaweed on our beaches this summer, occupancy and hotel rates are down, and we feel that that is directly linked to the fact that people remember the summer of Seaweed and the images from last year, and they were not, the pickup and the bookings were not as strong this year as they had been in past years. So I know that that's not an answer for you, but I do want to balance my presentation by saying this could be a one-off, one-time event that you just have to push through and then put your marketing pieces in place. But if it's not, then you need to be organized on a national and regional level to be able to respond to what could be potentially damaging for your business.
Okay, the next question is from Nicole Byer. She wants to know how long the season normally lasts.
Yeah, so it really seems to be different for you all down there than it is for us up here. We don't start to see sargassum on our beaches until March, and then by August we're done. I know that for you all down there it started in December, and I really don't have a better feel for that as of yet. Who would be in a good position to answer some of those questions regarding timing, again, is the Texas A&M University with the SEAS forecast that's in the presentation, and I would encourage you to reach out to them or other educational institutes in the region to get a better feel.
Okay, let's see. Next question is from Danae Hines. Are there any resources which Galveston may be willing to share with the Caribbean in terms of support for removal? Are there grants available that you may know about?
We were unable to access any outside funding for our activities. Fortunately for us, the hotel occupancy tax, which is levied against a hotel room, supports beach cleaning. Out of every dollar that's generated in a hotel room, 1%, so 1 cent goes to beach cleaning, and with 5,000 rooms and 6 million visitors, that generates for us about a $3.5 million budget.
Okay. One more question from Fredericksburg. I'm sorry if I'm completely butchering your name. Please forgive me. The gentleman asked, said, thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if in Texas you have already dealt with some problems, with some health problems because of H2S elimination.
You know, that was a topic for discussion last year as to whether the water quality was compromised because of the seaweed or the gaseous odors that it put off when it was decomposing. And there were some people that suffered from allergies, but our local health authority gave us the green light and indicated that there were no public health effects from the sargassum.
Have you seen any issues with broken electronic devices such as refrigerators or computers or anything like that because of it?
No. There's an enormous amount of debris that washes up with the seaweed, so strange trash comes in there with it and it makes it hard to pick it out, but no other constraints.
Okay. And another great presentation. Thank you for doing it. One of the questions here is, how do we manage the tightrope between cleaning and not scaring away our guests? I don't think that we have had that much negative PR yet, but this could be detrimental to the Caribbean.
I agree completely with that last statement, that you really have to manage it in order that it doesn't impact your business in the future. In that respect, you know, I know that it's expensive to do these things. If you can, if you're in a hotel area where perhaps several of you could share in some resources in beach cleaning and some rental of some equipment, that might be one way to approach it. Other way is if you get hit really hard, to look for one area that you're going to maintain and try to drive as much of your visitation to the beach to that one area and not feel like you've got to hit the whole template of the beach depending on how big it is. And then the education piece of it. I would really encourage you to get out there in front of it and be speaking to your visitors as soon as they walk in the door, as opposed to letting them discover that themselves. What I mean by that is simply that, this could be a one-off thing for the region this year. It could be that you survive the summer of seaweed in the Caribbean and you don't have to deal with it again for another 20 years. So if that's the case, then you need to frame that as a PR and a marketing piece. Some of the visuals that I've shared with you today, some of the billboards, some of the signage, maybe a piece in your guest directory about this being an odd year, maybe speaking to global changes. There's a lot of information out there, including the information that Cass put together in the resource guide, and I think that I would encourage you to look for ways to incorporate that, speak to the visitor about this just being out of the norm and part of environmental conditions that we're living in, and be very frank. And again, the more you can poke yourself in the eye and maybe make fun of it, could your animation create a skit around it? Is there information the dive center could be giving? Look for creative ways to communicate with people, and in communicating, tell them what you're doing and what you're not doing, and if you're not doing it, how that is going to protect the beach that they've come to visit in the future.
All right. Are there any materials that we can give to guests at check-in that are already created by reputable sources?
So I'd be happy to share with Adriana the rack cards. They're two-sided. I think we might even have them in Spanish. I'm not sure. And if you all would like to use those, feel free to copy those and use those. It's got information on it, and environmental information on it, and then it suggests some activities for visitors to do with the seaweed.
Awesome. Well, the last question, we're going to reserve it for a very special attendee, Mr. Frank Comito, our CEO, and he has a few questions for Kelly as well. One second.
Thank you, Kelly. Excellent information, and also thank you to all the participants and the great questions. The underscoring thing, I think, is that we need to take a proactive approach. The resource guide and the information that Kelly has presented are on our website, the Sargassum Resource Guide. They're starting points for what you can do locally. All the answers aren't with us. I think the answers, many of the answers have to be localized, and how you come up with them within your own destination. For the St. Thomas question, I think if you contact Lisa at the Hotel and Tourism Association, she also has the resource guide, and also may be part of a collective effort that may be underway there. That's one of the things that we're advancing, that it really needs to be some local collective action once it reaches a high level of difficulty to manage. And there are manageability levels, as Kelly pointed out. Just a quick question, Kelly. Our guides are a starting point, but it has stimulated other recommendations and suggestions, and I think we may end up doing an addendum to it. But around that, one of the recommendations we've received is about the possibility of placing berms or barriers to be used and placed at the sea in the front of the beach. The pros and cons on that have been discussed. One of the cons is it creates some diversion. Can you kind of give us an indication of what you're thinking, if you've had any experience with these kinds of management methods?
So what I understand you, Frank, asking is about to do it in the water, to place a barrier in the water that would impede the material from landing on the beach?
That's correct.
Right. So we evaluated some of those options. The first detriment that we saw to it is that as long as the sargassum is in the ocean and there's sunshine out, it'll continue to grow in the ocean, and the patches could just become bigger. The benefit of allowing it to land and getting it out of the ocean is then that you've taken that material out of the ecosystem and it doesn't continue to replicate. You could just, Galveston's a little bit different, and I really appreciate the localized response, because at the end of the day it does have to be a response that's appropriate for you. So if you're in an isolated area and you have potentially a beach farther down the coast that is not necessarily utilized by locals or by visitors, it might be effective for you to move the material with the nets or with a barrier down the coast. in the United States, we have strong regulatory framework, and because of the protected animals and endangered species, we weren't allowed to inhibit access of the material to the coast. And because we're such a highly densified area that if we moved it down our far beach, it was going to go to somebody else's beach. There are scenarios where that could work. Be prepared that if you leave it in the water, it's going to continue to grow.
Well, we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you again, Kelly, so much for your participation. This has been wonderful. Like I said, this video will be made available to everyone on YouTube. Not to worry, all of our participants today will get an email shortly from me with links on where they can go to get the presentation and the video. And also wanted to let you know that we have a Sargassum resource guide that's on our website, which is CaribbeanHotelAndTourism.com. The "and" is spelled out, A-N-D. And what you do when you get to our homepage is just click on where it says the environment, and it'll take you to the cast page, and there you will have a link to Kelly's wonderful presentation as well as the resource guide. Thank you again so much for participating. I hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you soon. Thank you, Kelly.
My pleasure. Good luck.